Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall. It is our second town hall today. It's a very special day. And this morning we talked about science fiction. We had a little panel, a little preview of a course by Stanley Chen, who's a writer and consulting editor for Protocolized. And we had a screen of Southeast Asia. And right now we have the kickoff for the Memory Research Group, which is led by Kia. This has been really exciting to see the huge influx of interest on Discord and elsewhere. Lots of people signing up for this research group, as we can see in the live stream. Plenty of people watching on. And so Kia is going to do a little bit of a kickoff today. We'll talk and get people situated with what the research group is going to do. If you haven't joined the Discord yet, there's a link in the chat. I highly recommend you do so. And with that, I think I'll bring Kia on to do her talk. And we'll just sort out a camera thing. While we're sorting out the camera thing, I'll give you a little bit of a preview with Kia's work. She wrote an essay in 2023, really good, called Artificial Memory and Oriented Infinity. Memory has turned out to be a kind of important cornerstone of protocol studies, because not only do you need memory to use protocols, like there are lots of different protocols for memory, for memorization, from Anki flashcards to remembering things at work. We have note-taking systems, we have ways of recording, and we have lots of assumptions about how this works. We assume that information will last forever. That doesn't have an expiry date. The way that we structure our memory can be very different. One example that Kia will probably talk about is organized versus chaotic storage. So you can think of organized storage as like a library. It's alphabetical, chronological, by author name, by like your DIN number, versus something that's chaotic, like an Amazon factory or a warehouse, I should say, is chaotic storage, where everything is just kind of put in where there's an open spot. Its location is recorded, but it's all relative. And okay, now we have video, so I'll bring on Kia, who knows a lot more about this stuff than I do. Okay, welcome, Kia.
Hey everybody, thanks Timber, and thank you for the sweet introduction. Had a very small technical issue, so I'll just bring up my presentation again and then just dive in.
Let me know if you need a hand with the presentation stuff.
Let me see. This is slightly new to me. It should be fine. Okay, share screen. All right, there we go. All right, can you see the slide in full? Amazing. All right, so this is the town hall kind of formally kicking off the memory research group. I did this short session at Edge Esmeralda, where Summer Protocols did other sessions a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about memory models, the book club, and the printing press. And so while that was a kind of informal session, this is the second informal session, meant to give an overview of the intentions for the group, how we'll meet, where we'll meet, what we might read together, and how it might evolve over time. So shortly before this presentation, I set up this link, memory.interlibrary.net. So this is a short link that will take you to a Google Doc that says a little bit more about the memory research group, as well as where we meet. I'll go over all of that in the call, but feel free to bookmark this if you want to return to it at any time. I'll keep this temporary redirect up while the group's running. The idea behind the research group is that we meet online every 2 weeks to discuss a text related to memory. So I've become really fascinated with the concept of memory because it has so many varied manifestations across fields like philosophy, history, anthropology, neuroscience, computer science, ecology. And now there's a a really strong tendency for the concept of memory itself to be conflated across these disciplinary fields where one definition or understanding of memory easily grafts onto another. So for example, ideas about memory from computing now inform a lot of how we speak about how the brain records and stores memory, supposedly. So I've really become fascinated by this conflation. And the intention of the book is to examine this concept in relationship to technology. So looking at things that are happening right now and projecting into the future, but also looking, several centuries, in some cases, several millennia behind, to look at different technologies for memory that humans have used over time. And even explore some thinkers that say basically technology is memory. And for this research group, anyone can join these meetings, but I definitely encourage regular participation. I would love a lot of people to join from different backgrounds, different levels of experience, and just the main thing, would ask that people join with like a kind of earnestness and desire to really explore the concept outside and inside of fields of expertise. And a little bit of background. If you're watching this, you probably know this background, but for the record, it's the group is beginning this month, and it's a special interest group that's incubated by Summer Protocols, which is an initiative by the Ethereum Foundation. And the Summer Protocols, or SOP for short, is the ongoing research and evangelism effort that aims to catalyze broad interest in the study of protocols as a first-class concept for thinking about the world. And so with this, and the kind of memory research group as like an incubated group within this broader initiative, we'll definitely be thinking about how the protocolization of memory, how the proceduralization of memory, and now about how the kind of equation or conflation of kind of memory and computation should inform how we think about it. And we'll have regular meetings, and where they will be is will be hosted, literally incubated by the Summer Protocols Discord. There's an SIG, so Special Interest Group Voice Chats channel. And also at the top left menu on the Discord, you'll see like events, and you can subscribe and share the event there, so you'll get little notifications when it occurs. In general, we'll meet every other Thursday, at least until the end of 2025 and potentially beyond. So we'll be meeting quite a few times. And in general, the meetings will be at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time, so kind of New York time. I've listed several other time zones there. Feel free to use a time zone converter. We'll all face the time zone change in different places at different times come October. But in general, this will be the meeting time. There might be 1 or 2 weeks where I have to shift the time, or I ask somebody else to take the reins. But in general, you can block this time on your calendar should you choose. And you can contact me if you have any questions about the group or anything. So my username currently is CompanionKit, and I'm in the SOP Discord. So feel free to DM me, or there's also a memory research group channel in the Discord where we can have async chats when we're not meeting. And you can feel free to just like share thoughts, questions, readings, anything you'd like actually, as long as it fits the Summer Protocols code of conduct. And the first meeting, so this is kind of like the kickoff overview archival session where I talk about the intentions of the group. But the first actual meeting of the group is tomorrow, June 26th, at the same time I mentioned, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time in the SIG Voice Chats channel. And for this group, especially because it's the first week, there isn't a strong expectation that they're familiar with this material that I'll be presenting. So for the kind of like roughly hour that we'll be together, I'll do a screen share in Discord and share some excerpts from this iconic book, The Art of Memory by Frances Yates. If you're interested in the topic and you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. Frances Yates is a bit of a idiosyncratic but very detailed oriented scholar who wrote a lot on the work of Giordano Bruno, as well as a lot of kind of like 15th century thinkers and practices, and worked with a lot of source material via the Warburg Institute in her time. So The Art of Memory kind of introduces the practice, the rhetorical practice of memory basically first documented in the West with Cicero, and then that's a little bit in the excerpt of the first chapter, and then it will go up through memory theaters, which are kind of using spatial forms and specific, potentially public buildings for these memory theaters and kind of making them more potentially collective or more potentially storehouse-like. And then lastly, I'll go over a little bit of how the art of memory and this particular rhetorical practice relates to the growth of the scientific method. And it's not as straightforward or as rational as one may think. And in addition to this, I just wanted to include, these are all listed in the document, the memory.interlibrary.net Google Doc. There will be additional references that I might talk about in the session tomorrow. So an original work by Giordano Bruno related to kind of figures and memory practices. And then the kind of like pop bestseller, Moonwalking with Einstein, that reinvigorated our practice of using memory palaces in the public and space repetition. And then also just a text that kind of spawns it all. And yeah, and if you don't know, if you aren't familiar with memory palaces or how it's called method of Loki or a lot of the things that these texts relate to, that's no big deal. I won't explain them on this call, but I will explain them tomorrow. And essentially the rest of the meeting will be spent on thinking through some of the readings that I'll present on this call, but also that are in the Google Doc, and taking like an overall temp check of the people who want to attend regularly, what kind of direction we're interested in going together after that. So it'll be a very improvisational, informal meeting tomorrow, and I hope you can join. And yeah, a little bit about me for those kind of cold calling in is I'm Keith Rutler. I was a Summer of Protocols core researcher in the first year, so it's 2023. And now I facilitate this memory research group. And my work on memory and technology now forms the basis of a book project called Artificial Memory. And I first started working on it as part of my time as a researcher at Summer Protocols. So it's really nice to be able to bring my background research into these discussions and to use it to ultimately make the decisions on what we'll be reading next or what media we'll be consuming next. But I also have a keen interest in like bearing witness to the group taking on a life of its own. I'll say a little bit more about those intents at the end of this presentation, but just to say I will guide and I will shape, and I hope they can really blossom into a really generative thinking space for a lot of people who want to attend regularly. And so that kind of brings us to the core question of the group that seems like a very simple kind of galaxy brain question, but it becomes more complex the more you think about it or remember it. So we have a lot of artifacts that represent memory today. We have things like memory cards. You know, this was back in the day where you had a 1 megabyte PlayStation memory card with a translucent outer shell. Now you have small SD cards that are like, you know, magnitudes larger in scale. You also have forms of memory that take this notion of memory as being a discrete artifact and project it onto the natural world. So kind of memorializing, often brutally, different specimens from biological life and from archaeological perspective, right? And which we learn from today. So this is a form of kind of discursive memory representation in its own right. And as it's currently defined in the dictionary, this is the Oxford Dictionary definition, the psychological function of preserving information involving the processes of encoding, storage, and retrieval. And what first also catalyzed my interest on this topic is that I previously worked at Gnosis, worked on strategy, and so thinking a lot about how kind of public ledgers publicly record information over time in a supposedly immutable, decentralized way, there was a strong kind of, again, conflation of the idea of that public memory being a type of memory that is living to a social apparatus, to a kind of societal or anthropological type of memory. And I became very curious about how people use the terms memory and data somewhat synonymously. Of course, from an actual architecture level, that's not the case. But a lot of the language that we use, even evinced by this definition, is basically shows that the process of encoding, storage, and retrieval feels like an inherently computational and kind of hardware-focused definition of how we think about memory, despite being put in the context of the psychological function. And so we have a lot of representations of this. We have 2001, where essentially HAL is deactivated by one, removing discrete bits of memory. And the most interesting thing is that he keeps singing the same song over the course of his memory being removed. There's not bits of the memory gone. So it's a funny kind of discrete representation of memory, but a kind of continuum downgrade and eventual extinction of it. And then we also have things like magnetic tape and kind of computer memory. And more recently, we have ideas of memory from things like Blade Runner 2049, where here Dr. Anna is basically one of the best in her field as a memory designer. So her task is to create memories that feel very lifelike for androids, because in this scenario, memories of childhood and other kind of emotionally charged, emotionally latent differences between androids and humans in this world is the existence of these memories. And so she can go from 1 minute kind of holding a console to being surrounded in a forest and knowing that many people will inhabit this as memory later. So memory design seems like it's a relatively new innovative field, or something like we haven't yet had the technology to do it. Like a memory designer, I've always felt would be a kind of a partial dream job. But when we think about using essentially software to encode memories, we have to remember that far before even the 15th century, people are using large systemic approaches, both clearly proven and rational, and both kind of like this, the spheres of the universe as a memory system. So having certain ideas about the planetary, the cosmological, the kind of overall milieu of existence of the human mind, and basically using these systems that we create ourselves to be able to map different memories onto them, either spatially or conceptually. So the art of kind of like memory design has been happening for a very long time. And this is what my research from 2023 showed me. And this is a kind of map of what I went through then, trying to understand what this idea of like memory design, or the creation of quote unquote artificial memory, has had a longer arc and history of. So things like looking at memory as a protocol. So the original inception, and this is mostly through a Western context from my research from 2023. A lot of the reading from the group will not be, but the kind of like protocolized approach to memory of essentially picking different spaces in a room and mapping memories onto them. It was a very procedural, rhetorical form of memory. And then you kind of come from there, you see this progression into taxonomy and into logic and into encyclopedias, which definitely existed in different aspects before this kind of strict historical progression. And of course, this diagram is not to scale in terms of the actual timeline. But then you have this kind of, what I found was like this other branch of thinking about memory, which was much more like associative and orientated than the kind of taxonomical encyclopedic approach that we've largely inherited for like archival systems that are helpful in their own right. Is this kind of approach by Raymond Lull and then eventually by Giordano Bruno of thinking about like memory as, in the same way from the previous slide, like associative memory could map onto the universe and like the spheres of the universe, whatever those may be. You could map kind of different thoughts and ideas to those, and you could associate them. And through that association, whether these things were necessarily related in what would be like a human readable content way, or in a kind of like goes with like way, you could do this associative memory towards different types of understanding of how things relate to each other. Abstract, but if you feel like it, you can read my essay from 2023. It's called Artificial Memory and Orienting Infinity, because I go towards this idea of orientation as something that kind of rejoins these two threads that I saw in my research. So this idea of abstract associative memory, but also being fundamentally reliant on the kind of universal language developed by Leibniz and others as a memory system, and how this kind of taxonomical and associative frameworks come together is like using orientation in a specific sea of images, let's say, that we live in today, to orient towards a particular direction and kind of trace a line and rebuild context now that we've lost a lot of context through the way that we consume media, where we'll have one image from 15th century, we'll have one image from a neighbor next door on their cell phone. We'll have all of these things come to us without necessarily the trail of their embedded context. So my work was trying to think about how do we orient in a sea of contextless memory. It's abstract. But as you might tell, I always think about this scene in Eraserhead, which is first kind of longer film, where at one point he puts his hands on a door, and apparently there was like 7 years in between Lynch then filming the rest, where he finally managed to open the door because he needed further funding in those 7 years. And for me, like, I've been working on the book kind of consistently, but there's a little bit of after moving and doing lots of different kind of complex life stuff, now I'm able to return to this research. And so in a way, I feel that this is kind of like my gap between like where I had, with the first essay, I had my hand on the little door, and then now I'm opening it again and kind of diving back into all of these topics again, fresh and anew. And from that, I've put together a list of potential readings. So these are things like, well, we'll go through them, but the idea is that some of these are things that I've read before and would like to revisit. Some of these are things I've not read but want to mark. And then there's some that I've read a little bit of, but the idea is really kind of to create this woven thread of memory as an interdisciplinary concept in relation to technology. So super quickly, I will go through some of the things that are also listed in the Google Doc. Initially, I categorized them in a much more taxonomic way of different kind of disciplinary fields or approaches. So things like culture, philosophy, and media memory. So of course, Francis Yates' book, as well as Mary Carruthers' work. An amazing book by Paolo Rossi, who kind of front-ran Yates in the 60s, called Logic and the Art of Memory. Bergson, of course, and Catherine Hales. Jussi Parikka, and Wendy, and this amazing book on program vision, software, and memory. So really thinking through, I've also become fascinated in my work with how memory itself kind of functions and as like a medium of software, where it's really, and sometimes really easy to rewrite and manipulate and recall, and just the process of recalling it changes it. So you can see where the metaphor of how we use software comes into being, and also the fluidity of it. Though of course, as we get into ecological memory or kind of hardware-oriented memory, while there's still entropy, there's a sense of greater permanence. There's also the work of Abby Warburg through Christopher Johnson's work. Abby Warburg was an art historian, and I featured him pretty heavily in the work that I did for Summary Protocols in 2023. And he thought in many ways about different types of associative, kind of symbolic, and sometimes connectionist forms of memory. And yeah, there's a few, I'll go into some of these other sources. But I also want to look at AI models and memory architectures. I want to look at biological and systems neuroscience. So basically looking from the 70s to today. I also want to look at computing hardware and digital memory history. So to basically look at the actual function and the mapping and the language that we inherited from that function over time as a specific historical occurrence into the language that we use now. And then fiction and speculative memory. This slide is shorter, there's tons of things, but if we do read them, I would like to potentially think about reading the whole book, which of course no one who attends has to, but that would be nice. And yeah, so the more kind of associative themes of inquiry are things like biological and computational memory. So thinking, what is the relationship of some of these? So one thing I've been interested in this kind of like lineage of neuroscience and biological memory is the ideas that of the hippocampus in the brain basically being the site that stores memory, being the site from which memories derive, and from which in this paper, Archie cortex is now kind of roughly synonymous with hippocampus, as it allows associations to be formed between any two patterns of neural activity. Once an association has been formed, the presentation of either pattern will tend to cause activity resembling the other. So you kind of see shades of like mirror neurons and kind of neural plasticity here. But in the 70s, it was originally formulated that the hippocampus is the main site of kind of this type of memory storage and activation. So I would like to read this paper as well as the hippocampus as a cognitive map. So essentially looking at how spatial forms of memory are encoded through there and how we understand them still today. And then basically pairing this with both kind of widely cited and implemented papers on neural networks or different approaches to AI, but also with kind of maybe less so. So things like hippocampus-inspired neural network for episodic memory, and then the influential paper in neural Turing machines. So the idea where you have computation separated from memory, and basically how that as a theory was derived from the hippocampus. So the process of storing being separated from the process of encoding and retrieving. So basically, in kind of comparing these two, we would also revisit kind of more classical debates between connectionist and symbolic approaches to AI. Future Rabbit here just is like kind of one of the few projects I've seen try to revivify a neurosymbolic approach to AI hardware. So this kind of like rough module that could span several sessions, it could be one, would be thinking about how biological metaphors and our understanding in neuroscience of memory now influences our understanding of neural networks in like a very one-to-one way, and also seeing where the flaws with both of those models come in. And then another kind of associative conceptual bundle, a lot of these overlap, but is memory, cognition, and consciousness. So I'd really love to read an excerpt with you all by Edwin Hutchins. So it's from his book Cognition in the Wild. So looking at how kind of naval vessels with extremely complex codes of command and embedded knowledge are able to distribute knowledge of how that system works into all of the participants. So one quote I appreciate of his a lot is just cognitive processes may be distributed across members of a social group, across internal and external structure, across space and time. And this is a pretty bad phone scan here of a diagram from the book, but essentially showing how different roles have overlapping knowledge sets. And rarely, but it sometimes does happen that there is one role that bears the brunt of one specific domain of knowledge, but yeah, not often. And why I think this work is really important for thinking about memory is that often, because of the metaphors we inherit, we think of memory as something that's inherently discrete and inherently located in the brain and kind of neurons, essentially. But when we look at complex kind of human social constructed systems, we start seeing very much how memory is in the wild, cognition is in the wild, is distributed in the system itself rather than in a specific discrete site. And I wanted to pair this with a book I've really been loving, edited by Janet Gyatso. She's at the Harvard Divinity School. So looking at different models of memory from Indo and Tibetan Buddhism. And you know, when I encounter a lot of text like Paulo Rossi's Logic and the Art of Memory, you see actually a lot of diagrams like this about like 500 years later, but essentially different conceptions of memory being able to be understood as not just like a faculty for retrieving objective records of events, which we all know is not exactly how memory works in our minds, but Buddhist thinkers have tended to treat it as a constructive operation that's really important to the processes of perception and even moral reasoning and soteriology. So Smriti Smriti is basically the translation that we use for mindfulness now, but also could be translated as memory, is not only cognitive but ethical within these frameworks. So you see this kind of echoes from Francis Yates' work and looking at Bruno and other thinkers, especially Raymond Lull, for better or worse, where memory itself is deemed to take on almost this sense of, in the same way that we might have a workout routine, or we might have some form of self-improvement, self-betterment. There's an idea that what you remember becomes who you are, and also that the process of remembering itself is actually a very complex perceptual process that is a construction inherently, and that part of the process of, in this kind of Buddhist context, is in order to think through that construction towards different ends. So it actually, memory becomes not just something that we're learning and understanding and looking back on, but something that can be cultivated and constructed and almost needs to be safeguarded to some extent. And you see really early kind of epistemic approaches to this. And lastly, this is a section I'm kind of excited about pairing all these three together, is thinking about this through a lot of research that's happening at Michael Levin's lab at Tufts University. So I want to read his paper, Endogenous Bioelectric Networks Store Non-Genetic Patterning Information During Regeneration and Development. So what that means in short is that we propose that this information is a kind of memory encoded in electrical networks of somatic cells coupled by gap junctions, and is stored at the level of bioelectrical dynamics, not genetics. So you see in a lot of contemporary research this question of like, well, where is memory actually stored? And often you hear that it's stored in neurons, but then you say, well, there's a lot of neurons in the brain, but not all neurons are in the brain, and for different types of animals, the kind of constellation of them is highly varied. And then when you compare this with kind of Edmund Hutchins' work of like cognition in the wild, you start to see that there are these like interesting parallels where memory itself is something that it is only, in this kind of my hobby horse and thinking about all of this, is that memory is something that exists between agents and is distributed in the world, rather than something that is stored discretely in a specific aspect of an agent. But it's something that actively remembers over time and propagates itself almost like a poetic system, although it does not necessarily one-to-one equate with life in that sense. So yeah, I would want to read these two papers, and then also kind of bring in Janet Piazzo's edited anthology and read a few essays from there, essentially thinking about how different forms of memory construction and distribution, whether it's in particular lineages, whether it's in the environment, whether it's actually looking at the process of remembering itself as a constructive process, could reorient us to the idea that memory is some type of discrete data. And then again, even more speculative memory, mediums and ecology, one section is there's another pop book by Lynn Kelly called The Memory Code, but I think it provides a pretty interesting overview of a lot of different archaeological work related to memory. One of the most well-known examples, I believe, like if you know this stuff, you know this, but maybe not in the whole world, is the idea of songlines. So practiced by Australian Aboriginal people. So at each location, a song or story, a dance or ceremony is performed that will always be associated with that particular location, physically and in memory. So it's the idea that you can walk a landscape and you will be taught and you will learn that different songs or different types of knowledge exist at different places in the literal landscape. And Lynn actually wrote this book. She was a science writer, and she was writing about lots of different flora and fauna type in Australia, and then realized a lot of the Aboriginal groups she was speaking with had much vaster knowledge than anyone that she knew in her discipline as a science writer. So that really transformed her whole trajectory of her career to look at like, oh, actually, how do spatial forms of memory, but also culturally encoded forms of memory influence our ability to know something? So in a lot of thinking about kind of memory and recording and retrieval, we have this sense that in the same way that people say like now we should relegate all remembering to machines, we have this sense that memorization is related to facts. But I like the memory code even for its kind of like pop nature, and it's because it shows that even with kind of like vaster, innumerable qualities that you can remember, it's not necessarily just memorization. It is something of kind of like knowing a place, knowing an environment. And in that respect, I also want to read this Borges story. Oh, and just to say also, we'll probably read an excerpt of Lynn Kelly's book, but there's lots of different examples in it that if anyone's interested, it's a really good research starting place. And then pretty speculative, but I really would love to read together some of Rupert Sheldrake's work, particularly his book, The Presence of the Past. He's most well known for morphogenic fields theory, stating essentially that there's a type of knowledge or memory that is by nature kind of propagated, encoded, and kind of transmitted into the environment by living things, but also it could be biotic matter, it could be abiotic matter. So he writes that life is a property of matter whereby it can remember matter, which can remember is living. So I always like to leave 10 to 15% of my research for things that are open questions, because in the way that kind of science always works is that, a century from now, a lot of things, at least 15% of the things we believe now will be wrong, if not more. And kind of lastly, one little cluster of research topics that I would like to go over is just a political philosophy of memory. So in a way, Bernard Stiegler is like really the most forward thinker of like in his books, Techniques in Time. There's 3 volumes, so volume 1 and 2, maybe we'll read excerpts from both, but thinking through like what is actually the relationship of memory and technology. So to read a quote from it, human prostheticity, our reliance on organized inorganic matter, such as houses, clothes, or sharpened flints, forms the basis of technical memory. So unlike genetic and individual memory, technical memory is the very process of exteriorization that enables the transmission of the individual experience of people from generation to generation, something inconceivable in animality. And I think maybe the distinction between humans and kind of other animals here is actually less relevant now, or might be slightly undone. But basically the thinking that what distinguishes humans is our technology, and that every piece of technology actually encodes a memory and is some exteriorization of memory. But unlike, texts like Freud's mystic writing pattern or other things, he doesn't shoot the line that memory is only exteriorization, but that there's a kind of embeddedness, almost like a kind of epigenetics level for memory through the technology that we produce. And then I also wanted to pair this with a book I recently read called Children of a Modest Star. So basically thinking about like what is the political philosophy of memory as a technology, and what are the types of political arrangements that can relate to basically this broad operationalization of memory as something that's distributed between agents rather than held in discrete pieces of matter. So this book kind of charts a history of political governance from a few centuries ago towards the future, and thinking about what is like a form of planetary subsidiarity, and what is this form of, in my opinion, like planetary memory that needs to be stewarded now. So in this kind of last module, like actually having a little bit of a teleology for this overall project. And yeah, so we've reached a safe point. I've been kind of rambling a lot. Essentially, the main information for anyone who's watching it now, although in 2 days this will be a less useful memory, is that the first meeting is tomorrow. It's at 10:30 a.m. in the Discord voice channel. We're looking at some of this with Francis Yates, these excerpts, and some of these additional references. And yeah, feel free to write me on Discord if you have any questions, and feel free to drop like ideas for readings in the Memory Research Group channel. I also included in the Google Doc a form which you can actually fill out and submit a reading that you think might be relevant for all of this. For at least the first couple of months of sessions, I'll make a call on kind of what directions we take and what readings we choose. But again, I would really love the group to take on a life of its own. So that begs the question of like, what is the Memory Research Group? I can't speak for all of summer protocols, but my feeling is that with these special interest groups, so there's one on kind of tensions and trade-offs, there's one on formalization of different protocol theories and mathematical formalization. And the idea of these special interest groups is that the way that Summer of Protocols has worked so far is that there's like yearly cohorts, each with different type. Each of the cohorts has had different types of objectives. So there's been things like our first year was produce a series of essays. Last year was kind of more applied case studies. This year is curriculum design. And so you have these kind of vertical solo but in communication projects. And now with things like the Memory Research Group, we have these tracks that are cutting almost laterally across the Summer of Protocols program. So you'll have people who are alum, people who are working on projects now, a lot of different research in this little nuclei that's been incubated by the overall program to think about these tracks and how they relate to protocols, technology, and memory. In terms of the Memory Research Group itself, at least this year, it will live on the Discord and we'll have regular meetings. It's an open question of what kind of life it takes on into the future. Maybe there's a really close group of regular participants and we start working on projects together and even start producing research in the future. There's also the option to submit works, so texts, to Protocolized. So Protocolized, I'll have a link, I think, on the next slide, is the kind of sci-fi magazine that's been developing out of the Summer of Protocols newsletter. So a lot of the works being featured right now are short science fiction stories, thinking about science fiction as the story of special rules rather than fantasy being the story of special people. And there's been a lot of great work on there so far. And there's the option, we'll see how it goes. Most of it's been fictional, but to receive different pitches for things related to the topics that we'll be discussing in this group. And if you're interested in doing something like this or you'd like to write something, feel free to post on the channel or write me directly, and I'm happy to facilitate developing a pitch that you would submit to them. So the group itself, it could be we write together, it could be we publish together, it could be that it takes on a life of its own next year, it could be that it continues as is, and just like a really close reading group. All of this, and even this presentation, is very improvisational. And as much as I will be directing it, I will be responding to the interests of the group. And so again, if you want to go to memory@interlibrary.net, that has the Google Doc that has all of the information. I'll update it for each session with the readings. You don't need to read them beforehand. You can just show up. But if you feel like reading them, you can. You can follow the overall Summer of Protocols program at that link. That's the Substack. You can subscribe. And then I, too, have a Substack where I publish a lot of my research writing related to memory, but also technology, cosmology, and my consulting practice on organizational design. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. That was a mouthful to go through these, but I don't know if people are watching or if Timber, you have any questions, but that's the spiel.
That was a great spiel. One of the best spiels I've ever seen. I do have a couple questions, and yeah, we can just see if there's any from the audience, or we could just do a couple and then call it good. My first one was, do you know of any kinds of rituals that encode memory better than records can?
Yeah, so I think it relates to some of the things I mentioned where it's theorized as it's actually a hippocampal process in the brain. But humans have a very strong ability to link spatial forms with memory. So, it's not true of all humans, but for the most part, if you enter a building a couple times, right, you'll remember the layout of that building fairly easily. Whereas if you encounter a list of different objects a couple of times, unless you have a particularly well-developed form of memory for that type of visual information, you're much less likely to remember it so quickly. So this was noted in this kind of famous story by Simonides, who was a poet. He was reciting an epic poem at a dinner party, and then he briefly stepped outside. This is actually the story that Art of Memory opens with. He briefly steps outside, and the banquet hall collapses. And they're not able to identify who the guests were, and they have to rely on him for the report of the people who were seated around the table. So he actually walked in memory of place to place for all of these people who are now deceased. And there's something about this kind of spatial remembering of being able to walk in your mind through the table or the alcoves, or a lot of people use their childhood school and they'll remember something down a hallway or something in like a particular classroom. And that ability to pair often just random information in those rooms is much better at producing memory than other types of just kind of rote memorization. You also see this a little bit in this technique called spaced repetition. But also, just last note on that is like even the story of Simonides itself has this kind of like ghastliness, like it was a catastrophe that produced the story. And a lot of people kind of on a meta note say that the reason why this story has survived as a kind of example of the practice is that also people are encouraged to use really striking, really emotionally rich events or images to encode into memory, because we're also more likely to remember those. So the story itself is an example of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, even myths being so far detached from reality in some ways, like, are incredible ways to remember things. And then the second question I had was, is memory a way of preventing us from getting lost, or a way to keep us productively lost?
Interesting. I guess it depends on what your aims are. I mean, it's a mix. I think that the way that we experience memory, I think especially now in the way that we consume media, a lot of it is relatively involuntary. So we have a lot of, kind of in the scroll feed, we can't really control what's coming next. And then, you could be sitting having coffee one morning and a kind of random thought about someone you haven't seen in 10 years, but they're on the feed comes up, and this kind of like intrusive quality to current memory. And then you look at like a lot of modern therapeutic practices, things like EMDR is a practice where you actually use activating both sides of the brain while remembering something in order to release the supposedly blocked memory and to almost rewrite it through that process. So there's all of these different methods basically of like how you can use memory in a way that is healing, but also in a way that if you don't look at it, it becomes incredibly involuntary, and your kind of attention becomes really waylaid by what you remember. So it depends on getting lost or not lost is all a point of perspective of like depending, it all depends on where you seek to be and whether you're there. But you can use it for all things. There's this Agrippa quote that I love where he's talking basically about like kind of printing press era of like everyone is doomed. There will be so much information and so many images, innumerable images, and everyone's going to go mad because they won't be able to sort through all of this memory. It will be impossible for people to rely on the natural memory anymore. And that resonates a lot today, but also we see how resilient the mind is at being able to encounter more and more information. So that's a lot of why I want to talk about this topic now.
It's a very timely and a very interesting one. So I'm sure that there will be some great conversations coming out of your group. I'm excited to see the outputs and the records getting transcribed in Discord. So I think we can call it for today. If you want to do any parting thoughts.
No, thanks for the time and space. And yeah, excited to attend your group too.
Okay, sounds good. I will do my outro. Thanks everybody for tuning in to Protocol Town Hall, a weekly guest talk series. We have some very interesting ones coming up next week and the week after. We have stuff on climate, and we have stuff on AI as normal technology next week, Wednesday, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific US time. That's nighttime in Asia. Definitely tune in for both of those. Same time both weeks, 1 p.m. on Wednesdays, 10 a.m. if you're on the Pacific side. Okay, see you on the Discord.